My son opened the door, looked at my truck in the driveway and said, "Dad, Allison's bringing her mother home tonight. It'd be better if you weren't here." Not angry, matter of fact, like he was letting me know about the weather. In 67 years I have never asked my son for anything. Not money, not a place to sleep, not a favor of any kind that could reasonably be called a favor. The only person who had been quietly carried for the past 9 years was him. He just didn't know it. I didn't argue. I set a cedar box down on his porch step, dovetail corners, fitted lid, built in my own shop over 2 evenings, and I told him to look under the folder before the bank opened Monday morning. Then I got back in the truck and I drove north. He stood on the porch watching me leave with the expression of a man who believed he had just handled a difficult situation cleanly. He hadn't looked under it yet. He didn't look for 4 days. "My name is Frank. I build things from wood. Furniture mostly. Tables, chairs, cabinets, the kind that outlast the people who commission them if you do the joinery right. And canoes. That's the thing people drive 5 hours for. Strip canoes, cedar and canvas, built by hand in a converted dairy barn on 12 acres outside Haliburton. My grandfather built the first shop in 1958. My father added the kiln room. I added the second bay and proper dust ventilation because I got tired of breathing cedar for 35 years without it. And at a certain point you have to decide whether tradition or your lungs wins that argument. Here is what I look like so you can see it the way my son sees it. I am not large. I have a bad left hand from a joinery accident in 2001. 2 fingers that don't fully close, and a shoulder that has its own opinion about cold weather. I wear the same 4 shirts in rotation. The truck is a 2004 F-150 with a rack on the back that has been loaded with so many canoe hulls over the years that the crossbars have permanent compression marks. I smell like sawdust and tongue oil and, in certain seasons, the particular sweetness of cedar shavings that gets into your wool and doesn't leave. After 40 years in the shop you can't smell it on yourself anymore. My son can. He told me once, about 4 years ago, that he'd left a window cracked in the guest room for the weekend I visited. He said it like a courtesy, like a thoughtful thing. I thanked him, and I've thought about those 5 words probably 300 times since. Jean died 2 winters ago, February. She was at the desk in the corner of the shop, black walnut hand cut. I built it for her the first year we were married because she said the folding table was embarrassing. And she was sorting invoices, and I came in from the kiln and she was just still. 64 years old. An aneurysm. They told me it was fast. I believe them and I don't, both at the same time, and I expect that's how it'll stay. She ran the books. She priced the canoes. She wrote the descriptions on the website in a voice that made people feel the thing they were buying had been waiting specifically for them. When someone sat in one of our canoes for the first time and it was the right fit, Jean used to say, "That one was always yours. It just hadn't found you yet." She said it about a lot of things, not just canoes. I'm going to come back to the shop. Everything in this story ends up in the shop. We had 2 kids. Cora, who is 38 and does marine habitat assessments for a federal research program in Halifax, and has no patience for anything she considers roundabout, which is most things. And Bryce, who is 41 and lives in Toronto with his wife Allison and their daughter Sophie and runs a brand consultancy called Watershed Design Co. I want to be honest about Bryce before I say the hard things, because I'm going to say them and I don't want to be a liar about the beginning. Bryce was a careful, observant kid. He noticed things. At 9 years old he could tell when I was tired before I could tell myself. He used to bring a stool out to the edge of the second bay and just sit there while I worked, not asking anything, just being present, which is the hardest kind of company to offer, and the best kind to receive. Nobody starts out at the doorstep. That's the thing I keep wanting people to understand. There's always a road that got them there. I know when Bryce changed, and I know exactly what changed him, and I've never told him I know. There was a buyer for a furniture distributor out of Mississauga who came to the shop in 2002 to look at a dining suite I'd built on spec. I'd known him for 6 years. He stood in my shop with his hands in his pockets, and he offered me 60 cents on what the piece was worth. And he did it with a kind of patient amusement, like he was doing me a favor by explaining the market to me. And I looked across the shop and Bryce was 14 years old, standing by the lumber rack, and I watched something arrive on his face and file itself away. It wasn't anger at that man, it was embarrassment to me. I took the number. I had mortgage payments and a kiln to fill, and I took it. I've thought about that afternoon more than almost anything else in my life. Because I think if I'd turned to him afterward and said one sentence, "Son, that's what it costs to make things that last," and I'd make the same choice again, I think it might have gone a different way entirely. I didn't say it. I loaded the truck. And Bryce went to Waterloo and then he went to Toronto and he built a company that, in his own words on the website, helps authentic Canadian makers find their story and their audience. Heritage branding, craft distilleries, small batch maple syrup producers, artisanal food companies. They build the story around the hands, around the generations, around the realness of the thing. And Bryce is genuinely good at it. And in 9 years he has never once asked to photograph my shop or my family name, or any of the 3 generations behind us for a single client presentation. He didn't hide it. That's the piece I've never been able to decide what to do with. He just never thought of me as something worth using. 9 years ago, in the spring of 2015, Bryce called on a Sunday night. Watershed was 8 months from closing. He'd overextended, hired ahead of the revenue, signed a 5-year lease in Liberty Village, lost 2 anchor clients back to back. He said it was a timing issue. He said it 4 times, and I let him say it 4 times, and then I asked him the number and he told me, and John wrote it on the back of an envelope. Here's what she did next, because it's the whole story. She didn't offer him money, she asked where the studio was. We drove down 2 weeks later. We owned a building on Queen Street East in Leslieville, bought it in 2009, brick commercial. 2nd floor, good light, had been a print shop. The accounting firm we'd been renting to had just given notice. Jane stood on the sidewalk in her good coat and looked at the building for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "He needs to believe he built it himself." We restructured the existing property LLC, registered it as Cedar Line Holdings, and leased the 2nd floor to Watershed Design at a rate that was, in 2015, close to market for that block. And then we never raised it. Not once. Not in 9 years. That stretch of Queen Street went from a tow truck lot and a dollar store to a wine bar, a boutique hotel, and a coffee roaster that has a line down the block on Saturday mornings. Commercial rents in the area went up close to 200%. Bryce's rent went up nothing. I ran the numbers with my accountant last spring, out of something I can only call morbid curiosity. The difference between what Bryce paid and what that floor was worth over 9 years came to just under $740,000. $740,000 handed to a man who had been quietly letting Allison's family believe he was helping carry me since Jean passed. And he never knew. That was Jean's whole design. She sat across our kitchen table and said, "If he knows, he'll never believe he did it on his own, so we let him have that." I've come to think that was the mistake. I'll say more about it later because I think some of you are running the same play right now with someone you love, and I want to be honest about what it cost. After Jean died, Bryce was decent for a while. He drove up 3 weekends running. He fixed a latch on the barn door badly, and I let him because the showing up was the point. Then it started, the way these things always start, too small to name. 2 months after the funeral. "Dad, we should probably start thinking about the long-term plan for the property." 5 months. "I just want to make sure you're not rattling around up there alone." 8 months at Christmas to Allison's father across the dinner table. "It's been a lot to manage, keeping an eye on him since Mum passed." I hadn't asked him to keep an eye on me. I hadn't called him crying. I'd been to Toronto 3 times that year. Twice to see Sophie and once because Cora was passing through and we'd agreed to meet halfway, and every time I brought something from the shop. A cutting board, a small bowl off the lathe. Not because I was performing generosity. Because that's what you bring when you go somewhere. That's how I was raised. But somewhere in those months, Bryce built a version of me. A version of a widower coming apart quietly in a barn in Haliburton. And once you've built a version of someone, everything they do either confirms it or gets reinterpreted until it does. I called and I was lonely. I didn't call and I was withdrawing. I fixed my own roof and I was being stubborn. I hired it out and I was declining. There is no action available to you against a version of yourself that someone else has already decided on. You just have to live inside it. And I told myself silence was dignity. I'm going to ask you to remember I said that, because I'm going to come back to it and I'm going to disagree with myself. Last October I drove to Peterborough for a meeting with my solicitor about some estate paperwork. While I was down that way I stopped at the studio unannounced. Sophie had a drawing project she'd been working on and I'd cut her a small panel of cherry oiled and smoothed, to use as a painting surface. The studio door was propped open. Bryce was on the phone on speakerphone. I stopped in the hallway. He said, "The Haliburton property is the real asset. He's not going to be running the operation much longer, honestly. And between us I've been worried about his decision-making since Mum died. He hasn't been tracking things the way he used to." I set the cherry panel quietly against the wall. I went down the stairs and got in the truck and drove 2.5 hours north without the radio on. When I got home it was dark. I went into the shop and I planed wood for 3 hours. I don't know how much wood. The shavings were piled past my knees by the time I stopped. When I'm that kind of angry, I need the work to be exact. Planing is good for it. Every pass has to be even and true. You cannot fake a straight edge. Here's the one thing I need to teach you about wood, and it's the only technical point in this whole story. And everything from here depends on it. When you're building a joint and the grain is wrong, when the fibers run at an angle that seems fine, until the piece is under load, it doesn't matter how good your adhesive is. It doesn't matter how true your cut is. The joint will fail. Not right away. It'll hold through the easy weather. It fails when it's asked to carry something real. I'd been watching that grain for 2 years and telling myself it was fine. I called my solicitor, Margaret Chu, the next morning. Margaret has been handling my affairs for 16 years and she does not use extra words. I told her what I'd heard. She went quiet. Then she asked if I wanted her to look at the property arrangements. What she put together over the following 2 weeks I'll give you quickly. Because numbers are numbers and they're dull, but you need them. 1. Cedarline Holdings lease with Watershed Design was in its last renewal period. It expired November 30th. Under the terms we'd set in 2015, renewal required written notice from the landlord 30 days prior. No notice meant conversion to month at current market rate. Current market rate for that floor, approximately $8,400 a month. Bryce was paying $2,950. 2. Watershed Design had not posted a single profitable year, net of the rent subsidy, in any of the 9 years it had operated. Margaret put both columns side by side on one page, and I looked at that page for a long time. Every year my son had shown a surplus. He'd shown it by less than the difference between what he paid and what the space was worth. There was no company. There was a talented man in a building his mother bought him, doing work that was genuinely good, sustained by a fiction we'd told him about himself. 3. Someone had pulled a title search on the Haliburton property in September. Public record. Anyone can. But you don't pull a title search on your father's land in September without a reason. Margaret said, "Frank, do you want my opinion or do you want me to just do the work?" I said, "Do the work, then tell me your opinion." She said, "He's building a file." I said, "Send the non-renewal." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "If I send this, his business doesn't survive it. Not at market rate, not on short notice." I said, "His business hasn't survived 9 years, he just didn't know it yet." I drove to Toronto on a Tuesday in November. Gray, cold, the particular flatness of light that settles in over Ontario once the leaves are gone and doesn't change until April. The cedar box was on the seat beside me. I'd built it specifically. Dovetail corners, fitted lid, cedar and walnut. 2 evenings' work. I wanted it to be good work because the occasion deserved it. Inside the box was a folder. Under the folder was something I'll tell you about last. My plan was to sit down with Bryce, alone, for 20 minutes. Tell him about Cedarline Holdings. Show him what Jean had said. Show him what was under the folder. I was going to give my son one clean chance to be the person I believed he still was somewhere underneath all of it. I never got the first sentence out. I could see through the front window when I pulled up. Dinner on the table. Allison's mother Phyllis on the couch. Sophie at the table in her green sweater with her measuring notebook open. The one she keeps records in. She measures everything precisely and writes it down. A habit that has been going on since she was 7, and which I have always found quietly wonderful. Bryce opened the door. I watched his face do the arithmetic in less than 2 seconds. Eyes moved to my coat, the waxed canvas I've had since 2003, which has seen a great deal of weather and keeps it, then to the cedar box in my hands, then to the truck at the curb. He didn't say hello. He said, "Dad, tonight's not a good night." I said, 20 minutes, I'll wait in the truck if that's easier." He came out onto the porch and pulled the door mostly shut behind him. And his voice went low and clipped the way it gets when he's managing something. He said, "Dad, Allison's bringing her mother home tonight. It'd be better if you weren't here. I can't keep being your safety net. You have to let me know before you just show up. I want to slow this down." Because the room behind him went quiet when his voice came up. Sophie looked up from her notebook. She looked at me standing on the porch in the gray evening in my old coat, holding a wooden box. And then she looked back down at the page. That moment, that right there. Out of everything, the money, the building, the title search, the conversation I'd overheard about my decision-making, that was the one that stayed. A 10-year-old girl looking at her grandfather and choosing to look at her notebook instead, because she was learning something in that moment. She was learning that when someone has been sorted into the category of burden, you look away. Looking at them makes it worse for everyone. The kindest thing is to not see. That's a real lesson. It goes in at 10 and it stays. Then Phyllis opened the door and stood in the frame and said gently, "Frank, they have their own lives to manage now." I said, "I know, 2 of the lives are mine." And Bryce said quietly, tightly, "Dad, please, not in front of Phyllis." There it was. That was the whole thing. Not shame about his father struggling. Shame about his mother-in-law seeing his father struggle. He didn't care what I was. He cared what I looked like in that doorway. Which, when I thought about it driving home, was exactly the same thing he'd learned in my shop in 2002, when a buyer from Mississauga lowballed me in front of him. He'd spent 30 years cutting that wound out of himself, and he'd cut off the tree instead of the branch. I didn't argue. I bent down and set the cedar box on the top porch step. Bryce said, "What is that?" I said, "Yours." I went down the stairs and stopped on the bottom one, and turned back, because there was one thing still to do. I said, "Bryce, look under the folder before the bank opens Monday." He said, "What?" Same words, same pace. I got in the truck, pulled away. In the mirror he was standing on the porch in the evening light, looking at a cedar box sitting on his step. The expression of a man who thought he'd managed something cleanly. He didn't look for 4 days. On Thursday Cora called from Halifax. She does not do preamble. She said, "Dad, Bryce called me. He's talking about power of attorney. He says your decision-making has been affected since Mum died. He brought up the property. He wants to know if I'll be part of the conversation." I was standing in the shop. The lathe was running. I reached over and switched it off. I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him to be very careful about what came next, and then I hung up and called you. Here is the hinge of the whole story. This is what I need you to hear." Until that phone call, I thought Bryce was scared. Scared people do ugly things. I know that. I've been scared myself. I understand it. You can come back from scared. I would have driven to Toronto and sat down with him and helped him come back from scared without either of us ever having to name it out loud. That's the kind of thing a father can do. This was not scared. A man who is scared does not call his sister to discuss legal guardianship of his father. A man who is scared does not pull a title search in September and start building a conversation about cognitive decline 2 months later. That's not fear responding. That's a plan with steps. I called Margaret that afternoon. I said, "What else do I need to do?" I invited them all out on the last Saturday of November, end of season lunch. Jean started the tradition 20 years ago. Big pot of chili, clear the workbench. Everyone who's had any part in the year comes and eats in the shop. I invited Bryce, Allison, Phyllis. Cora drove up from the highway. Sophie. I thought about whether to include Sophie for a long time. Some of you will disagree with the decision. I'll take that. Bryce came because he thought I was going to back down. Allison told me this months later, without being unkind about it. She said he told her in the car, "He hates confrontation. He'll find a way to make it fine." 41 years, and that was what he had on me. They came through the barn door around noon. Bryce in a new canvas jacket, fold lines still in the arms. Allison in proper boots, which I appreciated. Phyllis holding her wool coat closed like the shop might get on her. Sophie went straight to the strip canoe I'm finishing. Cedar and cherry, alternating strips, catches light in a way that stops people. Cora arrived 2 minutes after them, said hi Bryce in a tone that contained an entire conversation, and stood by the lumber rack. I let them stand in the shop for a minute while I finished a cut. Then I set the saw down, took off my hearing protection, and walked to the middle of the floor. I said, "I'm going to tell you something, all the way through. Then anyone who wants to say something can say it." And I told them everything. I told them about May of 2015 and the Sunday phone call, and the number Jean wrote on the back of an envelope. I told them the address on Queen Street East. I told them Cedar Line Holdings, and what a market-rate tenant would have paid over 9 years. And I watched that number move through the shop the way a drop tool moves across a concrete floor. Sudden, and then ringing. I told them what John said. He needs to believe he built it. I said, "She was protecting you. We both were. And I've come to think it was the wrong kind of protection. We handed you a building and let you believe you'd earned it, and then we watched what that produced. Some of what it produced is on us. I'm not going to avoid saying that." Bryce was looking at the floor. I said, 3 weeks ago I drove to your house with 20 minutes of talking to do. I was going to tell you every word of what I just said, sitting down, just the two of us, and you put me off your porch in front of your daughter." He said quietly, "I was under a lot of pressure." I said, "I know that, that's why I came back." He looked up. I said, "You didn't come. Do you want to tell everyone what you did instead, or would you rather Cora tell it?" The shop went still in the way of machinery that has just stopped. Cora said from the lumber rack without any particular heat. He called me and asked me to help him pursue power of attorney on the grounds that Dad was no longer managing his affairs properly. Allison made a sound. She'd learned about the building the night before. She'd asked him directly and he'd told her. She had not learned about the call to Cora. I watched her turn and look at her husband. That look, not rage, something slower than rage. The face of a person recalculating years of information that has just added up to a different number than she expected. Phyllis said, "Bryce, is that true?" He did not answer. He stood in my shop in his new jacket with his hands in the pockets, and he did not answer his mother-in-law's question. That not answering was the only answer anyone needed. I looked at my son standing there, and I want to tell you what I actually saw, because it matters, and because it cost me something to work out. I saw a 14-year-old in my shop, watching a man from Mississauga talk to his father like a favor, and deciding in that moment that he would rather be anything on earth than that. He built himself a life of knowing his value, of never being the man who takes the low number and loads the truck anyway. The problem is he built it entirely from appearances, and once appearances are the whole structure, anyone who threatens the appearance threatens everything. Even your own father, showing up in his old coat with a wooden box. He wasn't trying to destroy me. I want to say that and mean it. He'd concluded something about me a long time ago and stopped checking whether it was true. And once someone's been concluded, everything they do gets filed under the conclusion. You stop seeing a person, you start managing a situation. He wasn't cruel. He was a man who had mistaken management for love, and the kindest thing I could do was show him the difference. I said, "The non-renewal went out November 1st. Your tenancy ends the 30th. I'm not taking your company. I own a building and I've stopped subsidizing it. That is all that's happened." Bryce said, "You're going to destroy everything I built." I'd had 2 weeks to get the next sentence right. I said, "Bryce, if my signature on a below-market lease is the load-bearing wall, it was never a building. It was a very expensive idea." He took a step toward the middle of the room, not at me, just forward, the way people move when they have nowhere to go but need to do something. He said, "You've been managing my life for 9 years without my consent." I said, "That's fair." That stopped him. I said, "It genuinely is, Bryce. You didn't agree to any of it. Your mother and I made decisions about your future behind your back because we thought we knew better, and you never had a say. That's a real thing to be angry about, and you can hold it as long as you need to." Then I said, "And it doesn't touch what you did on that phone call to your sister." He had nothing for that. Sophie had been standing by the canoe the whole time. She'd heard all of it. When the room had been quiet for a long time, the particular enormous quiet of a space full of people who don't know where to look, she walked from the canoe to the workbench and stood beside me. She put her hand on the edge of the bench and just stood there. She didn't say anything. She's 10. She just came and stood there. And that undid me in a way that nothing else in the previous hour had. 3 weeks earlier she'd looked at me and chosen her notebook. Now she'd walked the length of the shop, past her father, and stood next to her grandfather. She'd worked it out on her own. A 10-year-old had corrected something that took me 2 years to name. Right there, in front of everyone, without saying a single word. That was the lesson getting untaught. That was the whole point. Watershed Design did not close. I want to say that plainly because I know how these stories usually resolve, and I'm not going to give you a better ending than the real one. Bryce moved out of the Queen Street space in January and into a smaller studio in Parkdale. 1,200 square feet, bad parking, a coffee machine in the hall that technically works. He let 2 people go, which I know cost him something real. He refinanced. He renegotiated 3 client contracts from the ground up at honest rates, which meant losing one of them and keeping the other 2. The agency is smaller and it is actually his. Allison stayed. Several people found that surprising. She told me over the phone in the spring, "I'm not leaving over money. I'm staying to see what kind of man he decides to be now." That might be the most clear-eyed thing I've ever heard anyone say about a marriage. I've thought about it many times since. Phyllis has not called me since November. I'll live. Cora came up for 2 weeks in March and we finished the cherry and cedar canoe together. She had never built one. She is precise and patient, and she asked good questions and only dropped the hand plane twice, which is genuinely better than I did my first time. Bryce came up alone in May, Saturday. He drove up in a 2017 Civic, not the leased SUV, his own car. He stood in the yard for a moment before he knocked. I could see him from the shop window. I let him stand there. Not out of cruelty. I needed to see what he'd do with the uncertainty. Whether he'd wait or whether he'd get back in the car. He waited. I opened the shop door and he said, Can I come in and see what you're working on? Not can we talk, not I owe you, can I see the work? That was right. I don't know if he chose it deliberately or if it just came out, but it was right. We spent 3 hours in the shop. He asked about the commission I have on. A dining table and 8 chairs for a family in Collingwood, black walnut, hand-cut joinery. He asked how I'd priced it. I told him. He said, "That's too low." I said, "I know." We looked at each other and he laughed. First time I'd heard him laugh without an audience in years. Before he left he said, "Dad, the box. What was under the folder?" He'd never looked. 3 weeks on the porch and then in the garage, and he'd read the folder at some point but never lifted it. I brought him inside and got the cedar box from the shelf in the hallway. Under the folder was John's technical notebook, spiral-bound, 40 pages, her handwriting throughout. Very small, very precise, the kind of handwriting that looks effortless and isn't. 15 years of sketches and measurements and failed attempts and revised attempts and started over completely attempts for a furniture joint she had been developing since 2007. A mortise and tenon variation for curved forms. Chair legs, canoe ribs, anything where the grain runs at an angle and a standard joint won't carry the load the way you need it to. She'd been working on it since before Sophie was born. She named it in the notes after our family when she started. But in the margin of the last page, dated about 3 months before she died, she'd crossed that out with a single pencil stroke and written one word beside it. Bryce. I said she wasn't naming it after you, because you'd earned it. She was clear about that. She said, and I remember this exactly. She said, "This one he can't buy, Frank. It's the only thing we've made that money can't touch." He stood in my kitchen holding his mother's notebook and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did she finish it?" I said, "Mostly. I've been working through the last calculations, another season maybe." He said, "Can I help with any of it?" I said, "You'd have to come up." He said, "I know." We shook hands at the truck the way my father and I used to. One firm shake, like closing on something real, and he drove back down the highway toward the city. He's been up 4 times since. He brought Sophie once. She had her measuring notebook. Here's what I've come to, and then I'll let you go. We talk a lot about disrespect and how it feels and what to do about it. But disrespect is loud and you can answer a loud thing. The harder thing is being concluded. Someone looks at you once, decides what you are, and stops updating. After that, nothing you do can reach them, because everything gets filed under the conclusion they already made. Work hard and you're stubborn. Rest and you're declining. Show up and you need something. Keep quiet and you're confirming it. My son concluded me somewhere in his 20s and never went back to check his work, not once in decades. And I let him. That's mine. I stood in my shop for 40 years making things worth more than I charged for them, and I watched him watch me do it, and I never once said, "This is the cost of building something that lasts," and I would make the same choice again. I told myself silence was dignity. What it actually was avoidance in a decent coat. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to do this week. And it costs nothing but about 90 seconds of being uncomfortable. The next time someone says something about you that isn't true, small, the kind you'd normally let slide because correcting it would make things awkward, don't let it slide. Say without heat and without making it a scene, "That's not quite right," and say what is. That's it. You don't have to win anything. You just have to stop confirming the wrong version with your silence. I let 11 small ones go, and by the end my own son was on the phone with his sister using the word competency. The question I'll leave you with, and don't answer it too fast. Who in your life have you concluded? Not who has wronged you. Who have you filed? When's the last time you actually checked whether the file is still true? There's someone. There's always someone. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I ask every time. Last month there was someone in Winnipeg watching at 2 in the morning before a shift, and someone outside a hospital in Fredericton, and I sat with the comments for better part of an evening. I don't know how any of you find a furniture maker in Haliburton, but I'm glad you do. Give me a number if you want. 1 if you think sending the non-renewal was right. Let him find the real bottom. That's the only way some things become true. 2 if you think I should have sat down with him first, told him everything, offered him a plan to walk up to market rate over time, given him the chance to choose right before I forced his hand. 3 if you think the mistake was made in our kitchen in 2015, when Jean said he needs to believe he built it himself. And everything after was just the bill arriving late. I have my own answer. I'm not saying it yet. I want to see where you all land first, because I've been wrong about my own family before and recently. If this one stayed with you, subscribe and come back. There's another one coming. I've been sitting on it since March, waiting until I had the last part right. Jean's joint, I finished the calculations last month. I tested it on 2 chair legs and a canoe rib, and it holds exactly the way she said it would. In the spring I'm going to have Bryce cut the first one by hand, here in the shop. Whip and tenon, no shortcuts, and I'll check everyone. He'll need practice before I trust him with a commission piece. She would have liked that. She wouldn't have said so, but she would have liked it. This is a work of fiction inspired by real human experiences, written as original content. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is coincidental.